Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. It looks like the event in Massachusetts this past weekend was an exceptional time. I know Lee Wright and the folks of the History List diligently worked along the American Heritage Museum. So, also, make sure you guys are heading over to historycamp.org every single Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern to join a fascinating live conversation with authors, researchers, and historians. Make sure you are voting as well through Spotify to help come up with the design ideas for their Pacific Theater launch. In addition to that, we are slowly beginning to work on more partnerships throughout the history and World War II history community. A new one that we are happy to join up with and help is the developing game Might and Fury World War II. Currently a Kickstarter campaign, I can certainly say that if you are a fan of games such as Axis and Allies, but not necessarily a fan of 6 hours that it takes to be dedicated to it, this is probably going to end up being the perfect game for you. Designed to be implemented in the classroom, this game will feature historically accurate game pieces and leaders to choose from, making it a fun and exciting way to introduce your passion of history to others. While still in development, I will make sure to post the fundraising link in the show notes. Now it's time to get to our final episode in the first group of our Warconomy series. If you have ever wondered in your life, or maybe in school one day, you heard something and it brought upon the thought, when was the exact moment the United States surged ahead of the pack, if you will, as far as economically? The best answer to really sum it up would be World War II. Now, that is not to say that other specific moments or eras in the United States' history that weren't great moments that placed them in the highest tiers within global wealth and power. We could go down a long line of advancement within the Americas. However, it was the size and location of World War II that allowed the United States to boom. Now, you see, while the Soviets, the British, the French, the Polish, our other European allies were hands-on fighting the Nazis or the Japanese in their own backyard, we were almost untouchable. Now, that's obviously outside of the attacks on Pearl Harbor, the invasion of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and I believe there was a rogue weather balloon bomb in the Pacific Northwest. I believe maybe it was Oregon that killed a woman and I believe her 2 children. However, the citizens of the United States were never really affected by the destruction and brutality of World War II. Factories opened and expanded. Goods were being manufactured at rates never before seen. And more than ever, businessmen were trying to figure out ways to take their businesses and flip them into a profit machine during the war. And it would be here in this moment that a man born in Nebraska, but made Louisiana his home, he would find out exactly how critical his business switch was, and how his invention not only made him incredibly wealthy, but it created one of the items deemed necessary for the Allied victory in Europe and in the Pacific. So in today's episode, we're going to cover none other than Andrew Jackson Higgins. So Andrew Jackson Higgins was born in 1886 to a state judge. He was a federal judge and a homemaker in Columbus, Nebraska. He did not have a lonely childhood, as most Midwesterners. He came from an incredibly large family and was the youngest of his 10 siblings. While the young Higgins was not an academic savant, he took all of the passion in his body and soul and placed it towards building and engineering watercraft. While there is limited information on Higgins, he did state that at the age of 12, he built a full-sized sailboat in the family's Nebraska basement. Due to the absolutely, a full-size sailboat, due to the sheer size, the family actually had to knock down walls in the basement in order to get the boat out. When they placed the boat in the water, they were even more shocked that it worked. After Higgins' high school graduation in 1904, he decided to move to Mobile, Alabama to begin a new life working as a lumberman. Higgins quickly learned the ropes of the business, and when working for a primarily German employee-based firm in 1914, he realized that he needed to make an action of patriotic duty, and he started his own lumber business. And for those of you wondering why in the world he would care about the German coworkers in 1914, we got to remember that this was at the very beginning and during the height of the First World War. So when he starts his business in 1925, after the dust had settled from the war, Higgins had amassed a small amount of wealth for himself and set his sights on the import capital of the Gulf, New Orleans, Louisiana. Higgins packed up everything he had and moved east to the Big Easy, establishing the company Higgins Lumber and Export with $15,000. But Higgins was no fool. He knew he needed something rare and unique for his business to gain traction. He needed to find an area that had not been tapped into yet. He had previously bought a small amount of land earlier during World War I that was totally, completely inaccessible for logging due to thin, narrow, shallow waterways, what have you. But Higgins' fascination and talent for building watercraft quickly developed and built a boat narrow and long enough to fit through the specific dimensions needed to allow for a successful extraction of wood. Once his company officially started in 1925, he used those boats to navigate and clear forests, grossing him over $400,000 in capital. Now, for those of you wondering what that means in today's dollars, to put it into perspective, it would roughly equate to $7.12 million in a single year. So Higgins needed to make an additional leap. He wanted more money. So he took that, and he would basically broker wood mainly from the Philippines, such as teak wood. He would trade wood, and the wood that he would receive in as an import, he would then broker that out and or use it to build specific things. So he was not only building boats, but he was also really involved in this import-export of wood out of New Orleans. Because of this, he was so unique, it was almost impossible not to be a success. And by the 1930s, he had amassed the third largest marine fleet in the United States trading between nations. So we're talking about, even with the United States Navy, he had the third largest navy, if you will, in the 1930s for the United States. The boats he had designed for his own use during all of this became an international success, and everybody wanted them. Companies all over wanted them. Different countries wanted them. And these were newly named tunnel boats. But these tunnel boats that Higgins had designed were not really necessarily good enough. They had design flaws, engine issues, leaks, breakdowns. The cost of constant use were starting to add up. And while the most sensible thing to do would be to bring in a marine craft designer to build you a new boat, Higgins took it into his own hands, and by 1928, he had enrolled and completed his bachelor's degree in engineering from the National University of Sciences in Chicago, Illinois. So after graduating, his boat building would expand even more, receiving an order of 20 ships to the Dutch. Higgins' attention was slowly being pulled away more and more from his lumber business that he had, as orders for these vessels increased. He had buyers from all over the world, including no other than the United States Army. By early 1930s, he created Higgins Industry to bring all of his businesses under one roof. And for him personally, by 1933, he would only focus on the boat design and building piece of his business, totally leaving the lumber business to be managed by men under him. So I can say openly by this point, which is, what did I just say, the early 1930s, Andrew Higgins is a millionaire in New Orleans building bespoke watercraft, if you will. Basically, every order he gets, there's variations to each one. He is telling people what kind of boats they want. They're not, oh, hey, give me a tunnel boat. Model 1, he is coming, what is the use that you need? I'm going to build the boat specifically for that use. So he was building very unique vessels at this point. And by doing so, this proved to be an incredible success for Higgins Industries all throughout the 1930s. However, there was one moment that grabbed the attention of military strategists in the United States. Higgins was approached to build a boat for fur trappers that they could nearly basically beach. They would have an easy access, an open access, if you will, in and out of the boat versus up and over the side of the boat. Higgins devised an idea of having a boat that could easily be used repeatedly with landing after landing on a beach without causing damage. And his design worked like a charm. The United States military saw the early prototypes of these boats, which were named Eureka, and in 1934 he actually traveled to Quantico, Virginia, in order to do a demonstration for the Navy on how these Eureka boats could be used for the United States Marine Corps. Initially too large and worried about the weight of the watercraft, the Navy had insisted on a final design for evaluation in 1937. Again, the Navy argued the boats were all overweight. And Higgins chipped away until the Navy finally agreed to the final design option of the Eureka. Now, so we had just said that he was basically going to the clients and saying, what do you want? I'm going to build it for you. Here's my design. Here's what I think is going to work best. I'm the expert. However, the Navy's a different customer. They are also experts. They have specific things that they're trying to go after. So this is the first time, and it wouldn't be the only time, that Andrew Higgins would basically get in a pissing match with the United States Navy. Now, a lot of folks are probably asking, why does this even matter, right? If it floats and does its job, then what does the size really matter? Well, while a superior landing craft, the Navy was not going to spend millions of dollars and already to change a pre-designed and prefabricated ship layout that only carried small Navy landing crafts that were 30 feet. The Eureka was a little over 36 feet, so it just simply would not work. After intense deliberation, Higgins cut the boat down to 30 feet. Not only that, but he took a substantial cut in cost due to the Navy's budget. While he had to allow the 30-foot Eureka to become the profit, he was still set on proving the worth of that original 36-foot boat. So as the war across the world was beginning to heat up in 1940, and as tensions rose in the Pacific, the United States Navy decided it was time to do a full-blown test of the available amphibious landing crafts. Andrew Higgins would proudly bring his 36-foot, newly named Landing Craft Personnel Large, or LCPL, to the demonstrations. And it was not the Navy who fell in love with it, but the United States Marines. See, now, the Marines were so in love with it that Higgins succeeded in convincing the Navy to buy the 36-footers. Over 2,193 of these vessels would be built by Higgins Industries during World War II. It's imperative to understand why these landing crafts were so unique and why the Marines and eventually the Army loved them so much. Unlike every other watercraft that had been built with the intention of an amphibious assault, they were built in a solid construction that men would need to jump over the sides with all of their equipment. These boats that Higgins designed literally had a front door. A ramp would drop in the front on the beach, and the men could easily walk off onto land without anything other than a small step over. This not only saves an absurd amount of time when you're trying to get boats back and forth, you're trying to get injured men back and forth, you're trying to get equipment to the front, but it also allows those infantry units to bring heavier and deadlier equipment right off the jump. Now, for the Marine Corps, constantly went back to Higgins asking him for upgrades or to change specific things. They would add machine guns. They would increase the hull capacity. They continued to go back. So it's not like Higgins just built one sort of LCPL and said, hey, this is it. There were a lot of modifications and a lot of different models that ended up coming out with these for the Marine Corps. Higgins' business before the war officially started was already booming with wealth. Even prior to the military contracts and active participation in World War II, in 1935, for reference, he made $85,000 simply off the Eureka crafts alone. In 1938, those sales went up $1 million for the entire year. So one year he made 85,000. The next year he makes $1 million. And here's the baffling part. In 1940, as the United States began really preparing its military for war, Higgins' industry was profiting nearly $1 million a month from the Eureka craft. If those of you wanting to know what is that in today's time, that's $22 million a month in revenue. Now, I got to come in right here and explain that the Eureka class boat was a massive umbrella of personnel carriers, vehicle carriers, assault boats, refits, specializations. The Marines even wanted a longer boat when the 46-foot tank carrier, which struggled to perform during test and was ultimately scraped. I mean, we're talking about so many different waterborne vessels, right? The Eureka class was huge, but it was the foundation of that original one that Higgins basically just built off of. That's why these boats were consistently good, is because they were consistently the same at the base. It's important to understand that a large majority of these light watercraft the United States were using in the war period came from the Higgins factory off Magazine Street in New Orleans. And we're talking about a massive production plant. And this brings us to the second thing. How in the world was Andrew Higgins good enough to produce these never-before-seen boats before? In such a short time frame with such great consistency? The answer is simple. Andrew Higgins was not just an inventor and an engineer, but at heart, he was an industrialist. He wanted to find a way to ensure that his boats were fit to fight every time. His staff of engineers, which was ballpark 100 men, were encouraged, they were told, to go into the factory, learn how these boats were built, learn a craft on how to make these boats, and truly understand the design of these vessels we are building. Their team immediately became diversified in many different crafts of boat building, and thus they were able to build more structurally sound vessels that made sense. And it was in this revolution of boat manufacturing that led the Navy back to Higgins with a big offer. They wanted him to build Liberty ships and placed an order for 200. Now, this is a massive undertaking, and it was such a critical time in history because never before had an American shipbuilder taken on such an order. I mean, he didn't even have the land or a factory to conduct such production. Instead of turning it down, he simply bought 12,000 acres and built a factory to produce the Liberty ships in mass. With his new production method underway, they would be able to build and sail new ships every 5 days. Wondering why that matters and how big of a revolution could that really be in this manufacturing process? Previous builders for the Liberty ships produced about 2 a year on average. It took them about 150, 160 days every time to produce one Liberty ship. So being able to punch one out in 5 days is insane. Everything was ready to go. And when the Navy came back to him with a list of items that were short, they simply told him, "We can't allow you to build these ships. There's nothing to build them with." Furious with the decision, Higgins and the Navy situation would come to the attention of then Vice President Harry Truman. However, the Navy would ultimately win this, of course, and Higgins' contract would be folded over because of lack of materials. Now, Higgins had an inside and was liked by many people. After getting to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's desk, he invited Higgins to D.C. to speak further about the situation. While there, he was told that the material shortage was, in fact, real. However, FDR had a need for the factory he had built. The government offered him a contract to build over 1,200 Curtiss C-76s. Nope, that's not a boat. It's a plane. So that doesn't make sense, except Higgins had previous aviation building experience. He had designed wooden planes and built them and flew them. However, there was a reason why he quit building them when a close friend and fellow pilot was killed flying in a plane that he had built. Yet again, shocker, they ran into material issues, mainly aluminum, and he would only be able to make 2 of these planes by the time the war ended in 1945. In all, Andrew Higgins is a hidden figure in the success of Allies during World War II. In his 20 years in business, he went from small wooden tunnel boats that navigate tight waterways in the southern parts of the United States to designing and building one of the most successful pieces of military equipment in history. And as we know it today, it's the Higgins boat. And just during the war alone, because we're talking about Warconomy, right? We're talking about people who amassed an insane amount of wealth during World War II. Just in government contracts alone, Andrew Higgins had received over $350 million. Roughly $8 billion as of today. Making him not only one of the wealthiest people in the country, but in the entire world. His evolution of the factory line and manufacturing process during the war would be used again in the Korean War during the 1950s. And it was so proficient that he would also build the Saturn V rockets for NASA. Andrew Higgins would die due to complications from a stroke in New Orleans on August 1st, 1952. Almost 7 years from when World War II ended. His dedication to the United States' war effort and the Allied war effort during World War II is remembered heavily today in the city in which he died. For those of you that do not know this, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana, is located on the very grounds in which those boats were built. And as you walk through the front doors of the museum, right in front of you is one of the last surviving pristine Higgins boats. I really hope you guys have enjoyed the Warconomy series. I know that one was kind of a little bit different than the last 2 we've done. There was this one didn't really have a sad piece into it at all. It didn't involve the Holocaust, but I really wanted to highlight the difference between a European business owner and an American business owner during this time. It was dramatically different. Two totally different games. So, as always, thank you to each and every single one of you, all of our listeners. Make sure you leave us a like and a review. Come check us out on all social media platforms by searching World on Fire Podcast. And make sure you head over to Discord and Patreon. Check it out. See all the new things that we have going on. In our next series, I'm going to take a stab at our very first biographical episode. And I know what you're saying, well, Nick, the last three were kind of, sort of, not really. I didn't get into all the nooks and crannies. I skipped a lot of pieces. I really wanted to focus on the business aspect of where they started and where they ended with World War II and how World War II helped them expand or collapse. This will not be a series like the rest of these so far, and we're just going to do one long, extensive episode over the life and career of Luftwaffe interrogator Hans Schraff. Now, if you've never heard of this guy, he was the foundation for the way interrogations are done today by many organizations. As we're going to learn in this episode, after the war, countries from all over, including the United States, hired him to train their federal interrogators. He actually retired and died in the United States. I have a feeling this episode is going to be absolutely amazing. And hopefully, possibly, it's all going to be new information for all of you. For our partners at History List and Might and Fury, make sure you are all going to go check them out. The more we take the time to invest in this community, the more we are able to do and grow. And I believe both of these companies give a phenomenal way to create conversations around the subjects. Thank you all again for listening. I'm going to see y'all in 2 weeks.